this next session, you'll see Philip Norman being interviewed by Steve Ansell. If you enjoy the session, take a selfie and share your digital festival experience on our Facebook, Twitter or Instagram accounts to encourage your friends to join in too. So now, please give a virtual welcome to Philip Norman.
I'm Philip Norman. I grew up on the Isle of Wight, specifically mostly on the end of Ryde Pier. My father was the end of pier showman, highly unsuccessful. I went to Ryde School and still love the island, though I tend to see it now as someone who didn't grow up there because I never went anywhere when I lived on Ryde Pier. I lived actually on Ryde Pier, but close to Ryde Pier, and sometimes on Ryde Pier. So places like Bonchurch now are a lovely discovery for me. I've written books about the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. Of course, the Rolling Stones came to the island once, played at the Eastern Pavilion in Ryde, still with the scenery for the play that they were doing at the time in the background of the Stones. I did play in a band a bit on the island, a little bit, but never with any great success. I always envied Brian Sharp so much of the Cherokees. I wished I was him. All the girls loved him, not me. That was my career eventually after being on the Sunday Times for a long time, meeting a lot of the biggest stars in rock and country and folk and soul and everything. And it was not a happy childhood, but it gave me something to write about. And people seem to want to hear about it. My grandma sold rock from a kiosk at the pier gates at Ryde. And she really became the reason I joined the Sunday Times, because I wrote about her and won a competition that got me onto the Sunday Times magazine, and that was a great thing to be in the 1960s. But Jimi Hendrix, I suppose, is the most mythic figure in the canon of rock, because he had a very tragically short life, but he was an extraordinary virtuoso on the guitar. All the guitar heroes, superheroes of that era, there were many, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Carlos Santana, lots and lots of them. They only had to hear Jimi Hendrix once and they surrendered. They said, we cannot compete with this man or this guitar. But rather than feeling any resentment, they completely worshipped him. He made guitars talk in a way, communicate in a way they never had before and they never had since. He was a virtuoso in the same way, perhaps, that Yehudi Menuhin was, but added to Jimi, which really wasn't necessary, was extraordinary showmanship. What he did on stage with his guitar was as extraordinary as what he played on his guitar. He would play it behind his head. He would play it with his teeth. He would lie it down and commit almost a kind of sexual violation on his guitar, all the time playing it. And climactically, as it were, he would set fire to it. In those days, he had rather a cheap management, cheap and crooked actually, who would then stick the guitar together again. They didn't get him a new guitar. He would just they would try and paste it together for him to reuse and re-abuse the next time. Jimi Hendrix's story is tragic because he died at the age of only 27. And this is something common to a lot of the great iconic rock figures, so-called 27 Club, who died at 27, mostly through excess of drink, alcohol, all kinds of excess. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. The tragedy with Jimi not only was that he wasn't really like that, he wasn't a figure of excess, he was excessively promiscuous, but in general, he was rather quiet and shy, and in private rather unconfident about himself, and didn't really think he had a good singing voice, always felt uncomfortable when he had to sing. And his death was avoidable. It happened in West London at a rather seedy little hotel called the Samarkand Hotel in Notting Hill, which in those days wasn't a chic area at all. And it could have been avoided. It was, again, it's always expected that rock stars get so drunk that then they regurgitate and choke on their own vomit, essentially. That is almost the standard exit for a rock legend, a rock myth. In Jimi's case, there's some question, indeed, whether that really was the cause, although he did take barbiturates, sleeping tablets, but he took what he thought was not a very dangerous dose. He didn't realize that every tablet, in a kind of utterly perverse way, was a double dose. So he took it twice as much as he thought he was taking. He still might have been resuscitated and might have been saved, but he was surrounded by people supposedly there to look after him, who didn't in the end. So that it was a tragic, avoidable death of someone who really was perhaps the greatest virtuoso that rock music has ever known. He came from a place which is not really associated much with great figures, certainly not in African-American music, not the cotton fields of the South, the Jim Crow South, but from Seattle, which is in the Northwest and rather cold and rainy. He was born into an America where racism, I mean, we were very conscious of racism today, but racism then was appalling. And even the greatest African-American musicians, and there were so many great ones in those early 60s, were confined to a circuit called the Chitlin Circuit, segregated theaters, clubs, arenas. And they couldn't break out of them. Even someone like Little Richard, an international star, even someone like Sammy Davis Jr., I mean, totally international star. When he appeared at a huge hotel in Las Vegas, he wasn't allowed to stay in the hotel where he appeared. I mean, that was how bad it was. And no one had ever really, the person who came closest, I suppose, to breaking out of that, it was a sort of a cultural ghetto, was Sam Cooke, who in the early 60s crossed over really into being a kind of middle of the road balladeer and was loved by white audiences as much as by African-American ones. But in the realm of hard, sort of visceral blues, R&B, they had to stay where they were put by the racism of the time. Jimi Hendrix had to come to London, which he did in the swinging era of the mid-60s. And there he was immediately recognized and adulated by pop's social register of the time, which were the Beatles, the Stones, The Who, Jeff Beck, people like that. And he became hugely popular in Britain first, then in Europe. And then he finally went back to America and he became a huge star in America at a time when the country was on the brink of revolution. I mean, race riots, not only race riots, but absolutely brutal repression of any kind of non-violent, even the most non-violent demonstration. The assassination of Martin Luther King, of Robert Kennedy was all going on. Jimi made a tour through that appalling landscape of violence and unrest with a mixed race band with two white sidemen, which was an act of the most incredible bravery and fortitude. I mean, it stands with anything that the civil rights movement ever achieved in any formal way. So that was his achievement. He completely broke out of this, of the genres where he was supposed to say he played hard rock for mainly white audiences, which had never happened, and really has happened very little since. It has happened, but not quite in the way that Jimi did, because Jimi, although hard rock itself, he really was the progenitor of what we call heavy metal. Most heavy metal is pretty awful, quite honestly. Only very sort of nerdish people who like repetition and parody sort of go for it, I think. I shouldn't say that, maybe, but I said it. But you can love Jimi. You don't have to like heavy metal to love Jimi. You don't have to love reggae to love Bob Marley. It's that same thing. So he was born into extreme poverty. His Seattle did not have the racial tensions of cities in the South, but still there was a defined area for the African-American population, and they had to stay in it. It was called the Central District. His father was when Jimmy was born, his father was serving with the armed forces in the Pacific. It was in 1942. His father had married a high school student called Lucille, beg your pardon, and he didn't see his son. His father was called Al Hendrix, didn't see his son, who was christened Johnny Allen, until the little boy was 3 years old. And Al Hendrix was a pretty sort of tough, unimaginative man who was determined that he was going to take this little boy in hand, and he was going to be what they thought of as a real man. And Al Hendrix reclaimed him from some foster parents that he'd been put with. And right from the start, they started off on the wrong foot. He made this little boy cry, even on the journey back to Seattle from California, where he'd been staying. And the relationship deteriorated even more when it was discovered that Jimmy was left-handed, or he was rechristened James Marshall Hendrix by his father. And that was a bad thing to be. There was still superstition that it was kind of somehow satanic to be, which his father, in fact, also had some funny little freak fingers on one hand. So he was very conscious of the idea that a Christian young man had to be, as they put it, whole. And this aberration of being left-handed was terrible in his father's eyes. So whenever he did anything left-handed, he would get a swipe around the head from his father. Strangely enough, I mean, this thousands of miles away, his exact contemporary, Paul McCartney, was finding out that he was left-handed. When he starts to play the guitar, has to play it what is the opposite way round from most right-handed guitarists. But that wasn't treated with the same brutality in any way, but it was already a strange link with McCartney, who later on would say that Jimmy's cover version of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, because he was brilliant at cover version, McCartney said was one of the great honours of his life. So my book does follow slightly in parallel the lives of people, the young British musicians who would eventually worship African American music and adulate Jimmy when he turned up in London. He didn't really have much of an education. They were very poor. His mother and father were in an awful, destructive relationship, both heavy drinkers. His mother died of alcoholism when he was only 14, just as McCartney's mother died when he was 14, not of alcoholism. She had also had a second son called Leo, a younger son. And in the awful homes that they had, Jimmy was his younger brother's protector, would look after him, try and protect him from these dreadful rows went on between their parents. And then something that is really not known at all, his mother then had 4 other children, all of whom suffered from birth defects of various seriousness, and had to be, all couldn't be cared for at home, had to be put into the care of the local welfare authorities. And so really to get away, the only way Jimmy could get away from this dreadful childhood was initially by joining the army. He joined the army because the one time he was picked up by the police for anything in his whole life was for joyriding in cars. And he was given the option of either going in the army or detention. He chose the army. He actually went into the airborne division of the US Army, being stationed in bases all through the Deep South, where the racism was dreadful, but to some extent he was protected by being in the military. But he was discharged by the airborne division after having made a couple of parachute jumps. And he was actually he was a good athlete as well. Again, you don't think of any rock star having been sort of really good at baseball or American football, but he was. And when he left the army, then he became a musician. He'd been in little bands around Seattle. And Seattle, they did have its own kind of tradition of Hank Ballard, premiered The Twist. Hank Ballard, who sounded like a white musician, but actually wasn't, premiered a song called The Twist in a ballroom in Seattle, and Jimmy heard it. But Jimmy had always based his guitar playing on white instrumentalists. On the very early rock and roll records, although the singers couldn't sing very well, like Ricky Nelson, they tended to have really good session guitarists backing them. So Jimmy listened to James Burton, who was the backup guitarist for Ricky Nelson. He absolutely loved Buddy Holly, because Buddy Holly was a singer and a brilliant guitarist at the same time. So his style was always really rather, tended towards the white pop rather than the black R&B and soul. But he could not break out of the racism of that time and the so-called Chitlin circuit. So he played in the backup bands of a lot of R&B stars, notably Little Richard, from whom he learned a lot of showmanship. But he could not ever make his name in America. And he did that really until 1966, and was almost getting past the age where people became rock stars. When he was in New York playing with a really sort of mediocre band called Curtis Knight and the Squires, and he was discovered in a club called the Cheetah Club by the girlfriend of the Rolling Stones guitarist Keith Richards, then known as Keith Richard, who he was a very good guitarist himself, but his girlfriend was called Linda Keith, confusingly. And while Keith Richards was touring Middle America with the Rolling Stones, she wandered into this club and she saw Jimmy and thought he was brilliant and recommended him to Chas Chandler of the Animals, who were the second most popular British band in America after the Beatles at that time. But they had dreadful management that was cheating them completely, absolutely appallingly. A manager called Mike Jeffrey. And Chandler wanted to become a manager. And as soon as he saw Jimmy, he immediately signs up Jimmy as his first client, his first signing. But he has nowhere to take Jimmy except to the Animals manager that has been cheating them all this time, Mike Jeffrey. So Jimmy becomes jointly managed by Chas Chandler, who is a bass player and has an instinctive, talent for recording and becomes Jimmy's producer. But at the back is this man called Mike Jeffrey, who is very much like the gangster figure in Get Carter, that cult film about it's awful sort of white hoodlum racketing around Newcastle on Tyne and murderous, savagely horrible creature, but under a sort of veneer of great charm. Jeffrey did not really have the charm. And like a lot of people in those days, a lot of managers, even the Beatles management, you can believe it, thought this music's not going to last, and you'd better have something else in reserve for the day when it ends. And in Mike Jeffrey's case, his policy was to work Jimmy just absolutely cruelly. When Jimmy comes to London, he can't do a big debut concert in a big sort of London venue because he doesn't have a work permit. And while he's getting a work permit, he jams on stages of clubs, swinging London clubs like Scotch of St. James and the Speakeasy, the famous clubs of the 60s, but for not really any money. And then when he gets a work permit, Mike Jeffrey sends him all over the country to places like Ilkley Moor in Yorkshire, Jimmy Wigan, places like that. Jimi Hendrix played, and actually rather liked the northern culture. He liked Coronation Street, and he liked fish and chips, and he liked warm beer, and all those things, that Americans usually don't like. He adored. So he embraced the culture. He was in private, very shy, quiet, unconfident person. He didn't think he had a good singing voice. He always was very reluctant to sing. But he had a wonderful voice because it's not like a rock voice. It's like a rather mellow sort of baritone, which is a wonderful counterpoint to this wild, wild guitar playing. And so Jimmy spends quite a lot of time going around these quite unlikely places. And he even, then he moves on, and Jeffrey launches him in Europe, in places like Scandinavia and Germany, West Germany as it was then. where a lot of his tricks come by accident, like the guitar smashing. He accidentally sort of breaks a guitar one night, throws it on a stage. The audience goes crazy, so he does it every night, attacks his guitar, and throws it around, abuses it generally. Eventually, he gets so big that he's launched back in America, but with two white musicians as the Jimi Hendrix Experience, a bass player and a drummer. And they go to America in this tour, this crazy tour of, he does one, his debut is at the Monterey Festival in 1967, perhaps the greatest of all the sort of love and peace hippie era free festivals, because people are sort of sitting down like an audience and be, not the sort of out of control later festivals that came along. And Jimi completely upstages everybody else on the bill by this routine with setting light to his guitar. Jeffrey, this is in 1967, Jeffrey is taken completely by surprise that he's been such a success and has to find other things for him to do in America, and puts him on tour with the Monkees. Monkees, the most bubblegum, sort of an audience of 12-year-olds. The Monkees are like rip-off Beatles from the Beatlemania era. And Jimi, the only time really Jimi has to work hard to win an audience. He goes on stage and these little girls are screaming for Davy Jones. But then the following year is this horrendous tour that it actually comes in 3 parts, basically is a year-long tour. And all through the South, and again, terrible racism. Jimi is very sort of clever, and he realizes that the best way for the best security he can have, he doesn't have any bodyguards or anything. He actually gets someone from a Ku Klux Klan as his driver. So he's okay. But still, that is a horrendous tour. He moves around, and he has a Linda Keith, the young woman who actually discovered him. They really didn't have a sexual relationship, although Linda, in the end, she wanted, and she felt that he wanted to too, but there were too many complications, like she was the girlfriend of a Rolling Stone, all of that. And he met up with another young woman, Wight, English woman, called Kathy Etchingham. And they lived together in a rather sort of domestic way, because again, this so-called wild man of rock, that was how he was portrayed, was actually rather good at hoovering and liked to have the beds made nicely and liked choosing fabrics and that sort of thing. And they wind up living in Brook Street in Mayfair, in a block of buildings where George Frederick Handel had once lived. This is now the Handel and Hendrix Museum in London. But at the time, Jimi, nothing was made of the fact that Jimi lived there at all. He tried to keep as low profile as possible. But he did live, and he became, because he had a very, very wide musical appreciation, he starts listening to Handel, oratorios, and actually believes that one night he sees Handel's ghost. He says an old guy in a nightshirt with a pigtail walked through the wall suddenly in the room where he was. So he had a kind of sort of domestic life there, but his promiscuity was extraordinary. And I mean, this is something now that we don't look, that those naughty old rock stars are no longer lovable for that sort of behavior. But as one of Jimi's friends, Robert Wight, told me, Jimi wasn't a predator. He didn't have to be. He said women were, he wasn't a womanizer. It was the women who were Hendrixizers, because, the cues would just be forming outside his bedroom door. He could accommodate them all. And, but of course, his regular partner, Kathy Etchingham, sort of put up with it for a while, but eventually sort of had too much when they were at some gig, and she went into the ladies to refresh her makeup and heard strange sounds coming from one of the cubicles. And it was Jimi in there with some woman he picked up in 5 seconds. And he said, oh, she just wanted an autograph, presumably on toilet paper. So in the end, Kathy really couldn't stand anymore, and the relationship came to an end. But she always, again, like everybody along the way, loved him. even when he was at his most impossible, people loved him. And the musicians, he completely eclipsed with his talent, loved him. And I can't think of anyone who has sort of aroused this kind of real love in the same way that Jimi Hendrix did. But in the end, he went from various relationships. He had a strange, also, a woman who was like a super groupie, as they were called Devon Wilson, who was African American as well, who became his kind of, his sort of major domo, if that's possible. I mean, she would direct the traffic backstage into his dressing room, and she would arrange sexual threesomes, which she might join, or then she might have a relationship with a woman, and she'd tell Jimmy all about it. It was a really weird relationship. But she was very much on the scene as well. But he finally meets up in then West Germany with a young woman who's a former ice skating quasi-champion, at national level at least, champion, called Monica Dannemann, who he already has a fiancée. He quite often acquires fiancées and needs to get out of it afterwards. But he had already a Swedish fiancée, a film star. So at this point, if we are to believe Monica Dannemann, and not everything she said could be believed by any means, they were engaged at the same time as Jimmy was engaged with this very much nicer, actually, Swedish film star. But he is in London in 1970, after leaving the Jimi Hendrix experience really fell apart because of Jimmy drifting into the company of a lot of nasty looking drug dealers, and the two white British musicians in the end couldn't stand it. Although the drummer still carried on playing with him in new bands. He was moving really into jazz because the way that Jimmy played guitar was very close to sort of Charlie Parker, sort of bebop in the end. And he even was doing some jam sessions with the most sort of extraordinary and most really unpleasant virtuoso was Miles Davis, who was more wild than any rock star, actually, and a dreadful racist and misogynist, but thought, like everyone else, thought Jimmy's playing was wonderful, but nothing really ever came of that. There are supposed to still be tapes somewhere of Miles Davis and Jimi Hendrix jamming, but they've never surfaced. But he reformed the Jimi Hendrix, a sort of Jimi Hendrix experience, for a terrible European tour, where he was out of it with drugs for a lot of the time. He sometimes couldn't play. He was ill. He had flu. He was in a dreadful state, which ended in an awful one in Germany on an island called Fehmarn, where there were Hell's Angels. This was like a portent of the Altamont disaster, the Rolling Stones at the end of 1970. On this island, these Rolling Stones completely went berserk. And Jimmy and the others just about got away, safe in safety. And he came back to London, where Monica Dannemann had booked a room at this small hotel called the Samarkand in Notting Hill. Jimmy was registered at the Cumberland Hotel at Marble Arch, which, if he had stayed in the Cumberland Hotel, we might still be listening to Jimi Hendrix today. But in this strange relationship, Jimmy simply couldn't say no. He couldn't say no to sex, but he couldn't say no to anyone about anything really. And so he ends up spending more time with Monica in this kind of basement bedsit in Notting Hill than he does at the Cumberland. And even the switchboard operators at the Cumberland are kind of worried about him, and he seems in a very bad state physically and very nervous. Lots of lawsuits going on. Mike Jeffrey is around this dreadful manager who never shows up at any of his gigs, incidentally. I mean, this is an extraordinary thing. And so he's with Monica, and on this particular day, they spend the day together. And in the evening, he goes to a party. She isn't invited. It's a Marble Arch right next to the Cumberland, strangely enough. And people at the Cumberland don't like the fact that he's with Monica. He doesn't seem happy at all. She's hired a car, so he's kind of her prisoner. And eventually they go back to Monica's place, and or rather she collects him from the party, and rather forcibly collects him from the party, and they go back to this place. And he has trouble sleeping, and he asks her to give him something. She has a residual injury from a ice skating accident, has a large supply of a tablet called Vesperax, which I cannot believe the perversity of any pharmaceutical company producing such a thing. Every tablet is actually a double dose. You have to cut the tablet in half. And she goes out. Now, the narrative is very unclear because Monica's later account has about 14 different variations. But she wakes, or he doesn't really seem to go to sleep until quite far into the morning. This is September. This is an Indian summer in London of extraordinary brilliance when it gets light very, very early. But he seems to be asleep, and she goes out to buy cigarettes. When she comes back, he is in distress on this double bed, fully dressed. And she calls his friend Eric Burden, the Animals. And Eric Burden is actually in bed with a African-American fashion model called Bridges. And they both go in great alarm to this address. And it becomes very, very blurred after that. But what is extraordinary is that Monica says that she makes the call to the ambulance after 9 a.m. in the morning. But Eric Burden always maintains, and so does Alvinia, that the panic call from her comes at dawn. So there are these lost hours where we know that some roadies went to the flat, to the bedsit, to get rid of drugs that might be on the premises, and they were on the premises. But it's these lost hours in which Jimmy might well have been in distress and might well have been resuscitated. In another very strange detail, when he is taken to St Mary Abbott's Hospital in Kensington, not very far away, one of the doctors on duty sees that he is saturated in red wine, and he'd drunk a sip of red wine the night before, that's all. He'd drunk a few glasses of white, but only a sip of red. And the doctor, in a diagnosis that didn't emerge for many years, till many years afterwards, said that he had been drowned in red wine. This is another weird echo of the film Get Carter, where Michael Caine actually drowned someone in whiskey. But it's racism, which really in Britain, the more jokey kind of racism had been in play with Jimmy. They thought they were being funny by calling him the wild man of Borneo, Mau Mau, and things like that. And he hadn't really minded because it was much milder than it had ever been in America. But undoubtedly racism came into play because he was brought from an address in Notting Hill, which was again a very, very seedy area, and a lot of West Indian immigrants living there in not good condition. He was just classified as another black junkie with an overdose from Notting Hill. And Kathy Etchingham, who became very much involved after his death, said that one of the police she later talked to about the case said that he was lucky to get an autopsy because he just seemed to be like that sort of, unimportant Caribbean drug addict. So it was a sort of, inconclusive verdict. None of the right witnesses were called to the inquest, and it was just, his death was rather sort of eclipsed by a further spate of deaths of big stars at the age of 27. Jim Morrison within a year, Janis Joplin around the same time. And people just started to think, oh, this is how rock stars go. You know, they are drunks and druggies, and they inhale their own vomit and they die. And that's how they get into rock Valhalla. So not any sort of interest was taken in his death until a long time after, quite a long time after. But still, there were many theories floating around, which in fact weren't nearly as wild as they seemed. One theory was that he'd been killed by the mafia, because the mafia, the American mafia, had been moving into the music business, taking over African-American stars, and simply not only African-American, but a lot of others. The Four Seasons, who were really, and still are, but were huge at the time, were completely owned by the mob, and they didn't get any of their earnings at all. They got a little wage. And Jimmy had been kidnapped only a year earlier by the mafia in New York. A couple of wannabe mafiosi who thought they'd like to get into the music business in some way or other, and they thought they'd hold Jimmy to ransom might be the way to do it. But he'd been released by negotiation, actually released through the good offices of people in his own record company. His record company had been, or it was Warner Brothers, but it was a division of Warner Brothers called Reprise that had been founded by Frank Sinatra, whose affiliations with Wise Guys were pretty well known. It's not at all inconceivable they had a helpline to the mob in any way. It's a great possibility. Even more plausible was the theory that he'd actually been assassinated by the American government because he was a menace in the way that subversive in his completely ignoring of racial boundaries. I mean, and the way white audiences listened to him, and he was becoming more aware of, his own, ethnicity and the awful state of race relations in America, and was starting to speak out and starting to have affiliations with the Black Panthers, the Black radical group of the time. And it was not at all inconceivable. They actually, according to Jimmy's brother Leon, there was a list of so-called subversives where Jimmy had the same level of threat, according to the government, as Osama bin Laden later on after 9/11. I mean, it was ridiculous. America was just riven with paranoia. They had a special plan that if the government declared a state of emergency, these hundreds of so-called subversives would be rounded up and put into camps. And Jimmy was one of the names on that list as well. MH Chaos, it's called. So that wasn't at all an impossibility. What seems to be the answer was that he had taken this accidental dose and might not have died if the people around him, particularly Monica Danneman herself, had acted in any kind of responsible way. But as the years went on, and particularly after the Watergate in 1974, the Watergate scandal kind of came to a head in 1984, and the American government was revealed to be a load of crooks and killers in every way, as they still are in many contexts. Questions started to be asked about his death, and he had died with very, very little money at all. And in the immediate aftermath of his death, rather than sort of make a public announcement of how grief-stricken he was, his manager, Mike Jeffrey, disappeared from sight because he was busily engaged in siphoning all Jimmy's money into his own bank account. He himself then met a strange death. He was partly, he had businesses on the island of Mallorca, and actually got Jimmy to play in these crappy clubs that he had in Mallorca. And he was still had those business interests. On a flight from Mallorca, his Iberia scheduled flight, on a day when French air traffic controllers were on strike and military air traffic controllers were officiating. The Iberia flight carrying Mike Jeffrey clipped a charter flight. The charter flight didn't even realize there'd been an impact, but the Iberia plane broke in two and all the passengers fell to earth as already frozen corpses because of the altitude, including Mike Jeffrey. Devon Wilson, the mysterious Devon Wilson, again, who was said to know a lot about Jimi and Jimi's background that she had not revealed, was one of the many deaths at the Hotel Chelsea in New York. The Hotel Chelsea is proud of how many people have died on its how many people have died on its premises. They have plaques outside listing Dylan. Dylan Thomas actually didn't, but he well on the way to dying while he was staying at the Chelsea. Sid Vicious, Nancy Spungen, that dreadful scene in the punk era happened at the Chelsea Hotel. And so Devon Wilson was died after a so-called fall from a high window at the Chelsea Hotel. In the end, it was Kathy Etchingham, who was this, very, very capable, very intelligent, very nice English woman who lived with Jimi for longer than any other woman ever managed to live with Jimi. Herself started an investigation in the 70s into his death, or the early 80s actually, and got Scotland Yard to reopen the case. And it went on for a full year, but they didn't find anything new. They felt they couldn't continue the investigation. Monica Danneman settled in Britain and over the years came up with all kinds of her own explanations, including that she knew that the mafia had killed Jimi. And in the end got into a legal fight with Kathy Etchingham, as a result of which Monica was under a court order not to repeat any further allegations which were highly libelous about Kathy Etchingham. And on the day that she was convicted of contempt of court, on that evening, she got into her car. She was living in Seaford in Surrey, I think it's Surrey, or Sussex, Surrey, I don't know, but Seaford, and fed pipes from the exhaust into the car and got into the car and killed herself. So in the end, a dreadful trail of corpses. Probably the saddest story after Jimi was his younger brother Leon, whom he'd always protected so much. And Leon really had no musical talent, not much talent for anything except petty crime. But Jimi always looked out for him. And after Jimi's death, because of being domiciled in New York for tax purposes, under New York law, his estate went to his father, the father who had never given him any encouragement at all, Al, who had subsequently remarried a Japanese-American woman who had her children of her own. When his father died, the estate went to Jimi's stepmother and then to his stepsister. And Leon's only share of the estate, which when Jimi died was valued at around $40,000, but then over time, as Jimi's posthumous celebrity hugely increased, it was up into the millions and the tens of millions, eventually the hundreds of millions, all that his brother Leon ever got, despite their father promising Leon that there was a trust fund that he would have. He didn't get a trust fund. He got one of Jimi's gold discs. He wasn't even allowed to choose which one. It was for not a very famous record. I mean, I did spend time with Leon Hendrix, and he just still has these awful sort of moments of humiliation where men, Englishmen in particular, come up to him and say, "I used to love your father."
Well, Philip, what a great story you've unfolded there for us, and musicians and music lovers, I'm sure, will be fascinated by it. Last question, I guess, would be, what's next? You've done all of these rock stars, the Beatles, Elton John, Eric Clapton. I mean, what else is out there?
I say this after every book, or I'm never doing another one of those because they're such hell to write. I mean, to make sense of the music business in sort of reasonable, readable prose is nigh on impossible. It's, the amount of dross you have to deal with, like number 3 in the charts, or went into the studio, or went on to, so repetitious. But I don't think there is anyone left, quite honestly. And I was lucky to, because this year, of course, is the 50th anniversary of his death. It seemed sort of propitious. I should have mentioned, of course, that his appearance at the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970 on Afton Down, which is remembered as a huge, I mean, the biggest, the most enormous festival with anybody who was anybody at the time on the bill. Jimmy was still the biggest thing on the bill. And of course, 2 weeks after that, he makes this, well, first he goes to the dreadful tour of Europe and then back to London, then he died. But he will always be connected, you know, by that statue, Freshwater Bay of Jimmy. You can tell by the sleeves, you know, it's Jimmy looking towards the Wight Cliffs. And it's always just a lovely idea that Jimmy and Wight, like Jimmy and Handel, you know, Jimmy and Tennyson.
No, just say it's a fantastic read. The Wild Thing, it's a must read for any follower of that period, and indeed since. So well done.
Thank you.
For that. And thanks for joining us here at the Isle of Wight Digital Literary Festival.
Thank you.
Our thanks to Philip Norman. Thank you very much for participating in the Red Funnel Isle of Wight Digital Literary Festival. If you've enjoyed this presentation, please consider making a donation. Follow the Donate Now button from the homepage of our website. You can also benefit from great discounts by ordering via Blackwell's Bookshop from our homepage. We'd like to thank the loyal sponsors who've supported the Isle of Wight Literary Festival over the past years. Without their financial contribution, it would be difficult to attract the many wonderful speakers we've hosted, while keeping ticket prices down. This year, their support has enabled us to provide the digital festival free of charge. Special thanks to Red Funnel, who've been our title sponsor for many years, and, as well as providing financial support, offer a warm welcome to speakers and visitors to the island for the festival.